Hytale is going to be an incredibly immersive game, that much is for sure. With dynamic sounds and an intelligent AI that acts on its own without the player, the world will really come alive around you. But we have not yet seen any sign of a mechanic for temperature, and I would argue that this is a problem and that it should be implemented before release. Just having a system for temperature in the game would provide for some incredible immersion. In this video, I'm going to explain why it should be in Hytale and how it could work. But why is immersion so important, you might ask? We have all experienced this. You're completely absorbed in the game you're playing, but then you come across a bug or a visual glitch, and you're completely taken out of the experience. At this point, you realize that you are playing a game. The immersion has been broken. To avoid breaking the immersion, a game must behave exactly how you expect it to. Now, the first reason to implement the temperature system would be to make the game look more realistic. When you go outside on a hot summer day, you can sometimes see the heat waves above the ground. This is called heat distortion, and it is caused by light refracting through different densities of air, since hot air is less dense than cold air. So when there is a significant temperature difference between the ground and the air above it, you will be able to see it. You would also be able to see this effect above something very hot, such as lava. Seeing this in a video game would remind you of seeing it in real life, causing immersion through association. There are also small graphical tweaks you could add to indicate temperature. To name a few: water evaporation, facial expressions, sweat, cold breath, window fog. Seasons could also provide each biome with some visual diversity. Just imagine seeing your good old base back in the Emerald Grove going from its normal boring old self to an explosion of beautiful autumn or fall if you're American colors, then suddenly transforming into a winter wonderland. You could even set the seasons to correspond to the calendar in real life, so you can properly get into the seasonal moods while playing. The second reason is even more important, and that is the mechanics of temperature. In Minecraft, ice melts if it's adjacent to a light level higher than 11. This works most of the time, but sometimes it just doesn't make sense. For example, if you place a magma block next to it, the light output will only be 3, and the ice will not melt despite clearly being next to something hot. Well, just code the game so that magma blocks melt the ice, you might say. But then what if it's covered in magma cubes? It won't melt then either. By not doing things properly, you cause an endless amount of unforeseen consequences. The best way of dealing with this is to make objects emit heat and make ice melt from it. Water would also evaporate when it's too hot, and instead of becoming an air block, it would become a vapor block, which looks and behaves identical to air, except that it will condense back into a liquid when it cools down. There are many small mechanical details that would add a lot of depth to the game. Here are some examples. When it rains, the temperature drops. Food cooks if it's too hot, or freezes if it's too cold. Fire and ice gear regulates the player's temperature. And if something is considerably flammable or combustible, you should be really careful placing it next to something hot, or it might catch on fire, or worse, explode. It just makes sense. The AI of mobs would also be affected by temperature. Bears would go into hibernation through the winter. Birds would migrate. Antelopes will seek out shadows to get shelter from the heat. The amount of depth it could add is astounding. It also looks like Hytale is aiming for a very complex farming system, and temperature would add a lot of depth to that. Some crops would thrive in certain temperatures, and it would be up to the player to create an ideal environment for the plants to grow, either by using a good location, a greenhouse, or a local heat source. Some crops might be more delicate than others, and thus more difficult and rewarding to produce. If there were seasons, the temperature would fluctuate throughout the year, adding another thing for the players to pay attention to while farming. Heat could also add some dynamic interactions with the environment. Plants tend to enjoy the heat, but so do bugs. When it's colder, you might have to spend less resources chasing after little buggers from eating your crops. And when it's hotter, you might have to water the crops more often, as they dry out quicker. Temperature could have huge impact on not only immersion, but also gameplay. Hytale is mostly focused on the RPG elements, but for players that are more interested in the survival aspect, you could have a separate game mode called Immersive Survival. In this game mode, the player needs to combat extreme temperatures by getting shelter, water, and special foods that give you protection against the elements. Not only will your hunger deplete faster, but you will also need to combat thirst and sanity, though these will deplete at a much slower rate. If your temperature is not comfortable, all of these resources will deplete more rapidly, and it might even grant you some debuffs. This would require the player to be hyper aware of their surroundings. To renew your sanity, you will need high quality food, giving you more of an incentive to improve your farms. Oh, and food will also expire now, so make sure you store them somewhere cold. In this game mode, you will naturally have to focus more on building your base in order to survive, rather than going out to explore. And oh boy, will there be an incentive to build. But once you have the gear and resources you need, you can finally advance to the next area. And what will this next area be? The scorching desert, the freezing tundra, and the boiling hot firelands. This would provide a natural progression for such a game mode. Seasons could also provide an increased challenge here, with temperatures getting more extreme at certain times of the year. If you look at games like Breath of the Wild, Red Dead Redemption 2, Don't Starve, Death Stranding, The Long Dark, No Man's Sky, and Oxygen Not Included, it's undeniable how important temperature can be for both gameplay and immersion. Breath of the Wild isn't even a survival game. There is no hunger system, but the temperature adds so much to it. It just wouldn't be the same without it. It really showcases how temperature can encourage creative thinking. For example, if you go into the cold mountains before obtaining proper clothes, you can find other ways to circumvent it, such as creating a campfire, holding a torch, or just wielding a fire sword. If you have ever played this game, you will know the immense satisfaction the player gets from coming up with creative solutions like this. And in Red Dead Redemption 2, the temperature system is more subtle, affecting the rate at which your health drains. I could definitely see something similar existing even in the main game mode of Hytale. Maybe your defense or attack would drop when distracted by the heat or cold, indicated by the health bar gradually changing color. This would gently encourage players to put some thought into what clothes they're wearing and paying attention to their environment, adding to the overall immersion without interfering too much in gameplay. However, without a doubt, the game with the best temperature system is Oxygen Not Included. Also a block game in nature, it would set a good precedent for how it could work in Hytale. In it, every block has a specific heat capacity, how much the temperature changes per heat unit added, and a thermal conductivity, how quickly heat can be exchanged. Liquids also have a freezing point and a condensation point. With this system and all the contraptions you can build to regulate temperature, it introduces a bunch of creative challenges that are a joy to solve. In Hytale, it would hopefully be much simpler, but there would still be many creative challenges around avoiding extreme temperatures for your characters and crops. But couldn't all this just be added with mods? Well, maybe, but I believe that this is a far too important feature to be kept out of the main game. The mechanics would be so ingrained in the game, you wouldn't even be able to imagine playing a version that didn't have it. Just the immersive survival game mode alone would spark a whole genre of mods. You could say that implementing it would encourage feature creep and that the game would take even longer to finish. But to that I say that this is too much of a core mechanic to be considered an extra that could be added on with mods or later updates. And the most important thing for Hytale right now is to establish as solid of a core as possible on launch so that it can be built upon in the future. The bottom line is, there is no good reason not to have a temperature system, and that means that the best course of action would be to implement it. And with all the focus the game puts into the elements, I think that temperature would be a great thematic fit for Hytale.